The conduct of the Vietnam War profoundly affected the 1968 presidential elections in the United States. The stress of the draft, the heavy American casualties, massive protests against the war across the country, and the surprising defeat in the New Hampshire presidential primary at the hands of peace candidate Senator Eugene McCarthy forced President Lyndon B. Johnson to recognize that he had lost the support of Middle America for the war. With no way out, he announced that he would not seek re-election. In the fall general election, Richard M. Nixon soundly defeated the Democratic candidate Vice President Hubert Humphrey. Nixon won the presidency largely on a campaign promise to turn the war over to the South through a program of Vietnamization. The Allies would equip and train the military of South Vietnam to take over all the fighting and pacification of their country, allowing the Western forces to withdraw combat troops as rapidly as possible. In June 1969, President Nixon announced the first of the U.S. troop withdrawals. The 540,000 U.S. troops were to be reduced by 25,000. Another 60,000 were to leave the following December. Nixon's advisors told him that they feared that the gradual removal of all U.S. troops would eventually result in a National Liberation Front victory. It was therefore agreed that the only way that America could avoid a humiliating defeat was to negotiate a peace agreement in the talks that were taking place in Paris.
My fellow Americans, I am sure you can recognize from what I have said that we really only have two choices open to us if we want to end this war. I can order an immediate precipitate withdrawal of all Americans from Vietnam without regard to the effects of that action. Or we can persist in our search for a just peace through a negotiated settlement if possible, or through continued implementation of our plan for Vietnamization if necessary. A plan in which we will withdraw all of our forces from Vietnam on a schedule in accordance with our program as the South Vietnamese become strong enough to defend their own freedom. I have chosen this second course. It is not the easy way. It is the right way.
The massive Tet Offensive of 1968 effectively destroyed the local Viet Cong units as an effective fighting force through heavy troop casualties and wiped out most of the trained leadership. How badly they were hurt was never realized by the American public. The Phoenix program located and neutralized the Viet Cong political cadres throughout the country. When they had been identified, death squads were sent in to execute them. Between 1968 and 1971, an estimated 40,974 members of the NLF were killed in this way.
Part of the clandestine war included finding who the enemy cadres were, the Viet Cong who were operating at night among the villages. Some of the programs that the CIA and Special Forces began included the Phoenix program, McAfee's SOG, and other very secret programs. Both the Marine Corps and the United States Army developed very advanced sniping programs during the Vietnam War. There had always been sharpshooters in the United States military, but it was finally in Vietnam that both services determined that you needed to have a professional, not just a good hunter in the company who was assigned by the company commander to shoot at the enemy at long range if he showed himself, but those who were professionals who could be relied on to make long shots or to gather intelligence on the battlefield.
The regional forces and other paramilitary units of the South, for a time, were able to defend their fortified hamlets and it seemed that pacification and the Vietnamization efforts had a chance to succeed. From that time until the total withdrawal of Allied combat troops, large regular troop units stayed inside the wire to focus on training the South Vietnamese military to take over the fighting, and to reduce the number of American casualties presented as a box score each evening on the television news. As a result, Special Operations Forces were given the role of taking over most attacks against the North Vietnamese Army troops flooding down the Ho Chi Minh Trail to replace the decimated Viet Cong units. This is a principle of war known as economy of force, and a small percentage of warriors took over an increasing burden of the actual offensive combat throughout the region. February 1st, 1969, the LRP units were converted to ranger companies.
By the time I had gotten there, in 1969, the Army went to the reorganize under the regimental system, and under that reorganization, all of the long-range patrol companies were made letter companies and organized under the 75th Infantry, which was Merrill's Marauders lineage. And that's how November Company 75th Rangers came to be, from the 74th Long Range Patrol, which came from the 173rd Long Range Reconnaissance Platoon.
In the beginning, the redesignation did not affect the operations of the LRP units. One ranger company was then assigned to each U.S. division or separate brigade and took over active defense and assaults around each larger unit.
We were all the same people. We did pretty much all the same stuff, just adapting to the war, as it progressed. November 75th was increased to a full company, plus about 140 men, organized, like I say, into platoons, although we still operated with the same 6-man reconnaissance elements that the original 173rd platoon, reconnaissance platoon did. So our primary mission was reconnaissance, finding the enemy for the commander to exploit that intelligence.
The Special Operatives' mission had not changed, but the tactics of the enemy had in response to the threat posed by the Shadow Warriors.
In 1970, the enemy at that time was operating, they would disperse into small 3 to 5 man elements to infiltrate through the area, and then they would reassemble again into a company or regimental base camp for training or operations or whatever else they needed to conduct. But during the day, when they moved, they would break up into small teams, so that they could infiltrate, and if one team got hit, then, wouldn't wipe out the main body. So by then, instead of just pure reconnaissance, we started doing a lot of ambush patrols, because, why report on a 3 to 5 man element when you can just take them out in an ambush?
As the parent units began to withdraw from Vietnam, the nature of the war changed.
Most of the infantry battalions were engaged in training ARVN forces at that time, so you had a lessening of offensive operations. You had units beginning to pull back, and so this increased the risk to the units and allowed gave the enemy an opportunity to reorganize or to even gain the initiative. So to prevent that from happening, that's when in 75th was increased to overstrength company strength, so that there were enough patrol teams to form a screen around the 173rd Airborne Brigade's area of operations. We were the forward screen that kept the enemy, reported on the enemy, located the enemy, kept them off balance, did the ambushes, and prevented them from organizing and conducting some large-scale operations down in the coastal plain.
It seemed as if the Shadow Warriors were fighting the war alone. It was a heavy burden to bear, but one that these specially trained volunteers accomplished, but at a great cost.
Our Ranger Company was the only one of the 173rd Airborne Brigade doing offensive operations. At times, there were weeks when we got more body count, killed more enemy soldiers than the entire rest of the 173rd Airborne Brigade put together.
The new reality of the war began to cloud the true role of the Rangers. The principal mission of the LRPs in Vietnam had been to locate and report forces so they could be engaged by battalions or targeted for airstrikes. But now, the Rangers were too often used for other tasks, such as small raids, ambushes, and point security. The special operations teams were ill-suited for these roles, and they sometimes ended in disaster. James Fowler remembers one tragic loss when 2 teams were sent into the field.
So McAllister's down there around last light, pulls the ambush off. As soon as he blows the ambush, he immediately starts receiving heavy fire from the mouth, the wood line of the Ondo. So his team is here. He pulls the ambush off, hits the point element. I don't know what in the world he hit. It must have been at least a company. But as soon as he pulled the ambush off, he starts receiving heavy incoming fire from the direction they came from.
Over the radio, Fowler hears a fatal order from the company commander.
So he hit the point element of a heck of a lot larger force. And my RTO, like I said, we were way up on top of the mountain. My radio telephone operator said, I reached back and grabbed his handset to monitor the traffic. And I heard, and Captain Lawton told McAllister, I want you to secure and check the kill zone. Now, again, they're still receiving fire. I told my guys, this ain't no way in hell. So they make a gunship run. And from up high, you could see the gunship was off. It was too far off to one side. It was not a main hit. It was not a big hit on where the main fire was coming from. McAllister went out anyway. Got killed. Got shot in the head, got shot in the leg. And again, this is the guy I told you was Sergeant Rock. It took me many, many years to not blame Captain Lawton for that.
As the Americans began to withdraw, the emboldened North Vietnamese army began to use their safe havens in Laos and Cambodia as more than supply routes and staging areas. Cross-border attacks increased in number and unit size. By 1970, Soviet and Communist Chinese supplied tanks suddenly appeared inside the South Vietnamese border and attacked fortified hamlets and special forces posts under cover of darkness, using mostly light PT-76 light amphibious tanks, which had been infiltrated and hidden in the jungle. Long Bay and other outnumbered posts sent out desperate radio calls that included the unbelievable plea for help: tanks in the wire. Light anti-tank rockets, known as LAWs, used as bunker busters for many years, now had to be used for their intended role, to stop armor at close range. The North Vietnamese were also using other principles of war: mass, offensive, and of course, surprise. On April 30th of 1970, President Richard Nixon declared to a television audience that the American military troops, accompanied by the South Vietnamese People's Army, were to invade Cambodia.
To protect our men who are in Vietnam and to guarantee the continued success of our withdrawal and Vietnamization programs, I have concluded that the time has come for action.
The invasion was under the pretext of disrupting the North Vietnamese supply lines. They also invaded in order to bomb and destroy the Viet Cong base camps that were backing up the other operations in South Vietnam. Although Nixon officially declared the invasion in April, there had been air raids in Cambodia for the past year without the American citizens' knowledge. Basically, Nixon had been ordering bombings and special ops raids into Cambodia for months before actually declaring an invasion. To cripple the efforts of the communists, President Nixon approved the incursion a few miles across the border into Cambodia from April through June 1970 to destroy supply depots, training camps, and to disrupt the bases used to attack South Vietnam from sanctuaries previously considered out of bounds. While South Vietnamese and Special Operations Forces led the way, they were followed closely by elements of the U.S. 1st Cavalry, 4th Infantry, 25th Infantry, 101st Airborne, 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment, and other units. By May 6th, a total of 90,000 Allied troops were fighting inside Cambodia. While true guerrilla forces never defend against superior forces, a few hard-fought delays to trade blood for time resulted in heavy losses on both sides, as the communists sought to evacuate troops and the Viet Cong government in exile to fight again another day. Enormous stocks of supplies and a vast training and barracks complex were destroyed, but the Soviets and Communist Chinese quickly replaced the material losses, since the North Vietnamese ports were neither blockaded nor mined at this time. Alongside their Western allies, the combat forces of the South appeared to fight well, and Vietnamization seemed to be progressing. The relief that the soldiers may have been coming home quickly fled the minds of their waiting families. Many of the people of America became filled with anger and shock. As a result, protests, both peaceful and violent, erupted across the country. This reaction was significant in the Vietnam War conflict because it marked the beginning of the large disagreement between the American citizens and the military arrangements that Nixon declared. Protests spread across the nation, and colleges were shut down by protesters. The National Guard and police opened fire on protesters at Kent State, Jackson State, and other locations off campus. Like the Tet Offensive, military success by the Western Allies against the Communists was transformed into a political defeat by energizing the anti-war movement across Western and neutral countries. The fact that the U.S. was pulling out was not lost on the men coming in country to replace those that had finished their 365-day tour of duty or who left as casualties.
Well, when I first got over in Vietnam, I went with the 1st Cav, 5th to the 7th, down south around Song Bay. That was in October, November of 70 in there. And the 5th to the 7th stood down and went home. And it was around the end of December, middle of January. That's when I had too much time left in country to go home with them, so they just sent us up. But at that time, we were just fillers, whoever needed it. When I first got there in country, the 1st Cav needed replacements. When the 1st Cav went home, the 5th to the 7th part of the 1st Cav went home. Then I went up north with the 101st.
The war in Vietnam would be fought differently. There would be no more search and destroy missions. No more would America flex its military muscle. It was now a war fought by Vietnamese against Vietnamese. The U.S. military was supposed to play a supporting role.
The 1st of the 501st main rear fire, or not fire base, but main place was at Phu Bai. That's where the battalion was, right there. And we'd work out of small little fire bases out in different areas around in Vietnam. We worked up around the DMZ, worked in the A Shaw, a lot in different areas.
Just because the Americans were in a supporting role did not mean they were out of the fight. There were still bases to defend and patrols to perform.
Recon, we were in a small units. I think there was 6 men. It depended if the lieutenant went out with you or not. But usually it was just 6-man teams. Yeah, you had different missions, what you were supposed to go out, get information, if, just like when we went over in Laos, we went way out ahead of them and they dropped us off. We went out of Vandergrift, Firebase Vandergrift up there. We went ahead and then our mission was to work our way back and get as much information and try not to get into contact, but if you did, you did. You know, I mean, like I say, you're a six-man team. You're not out there trying to, hello, here I am. You know, no, nothing like that.
If you weren't on patrol or maintaining equipment, for most of the Americans left in Vietnam, it was a matter of waiting.
Unlike the outfits that were in the field all the time, we were in base camp. So you pulled a tour on the bunker line, but then, you know, throughout the day, you know, people did stuff, and then, you know, like I had additional duties like motor officer, stuff like that.
Waiting. It is what soldiers around the world are trained to do until they're called upon for what Teddy Roosevelt called the crowded hour.
And then what would happen is that you get the signal that something had happened, they needed you. And I can't remember what the signal was, but everybody had to run, grab all their stuff, hop on a helicopter, and out you went.
Like the cavalry in the Old West, the young sky troopers would saddle up and ride to the sound of the guns. The missions would vary, but for the Blues, they were always dangerous.
The type of things we did was, like I told you, if a helicopter was shot down, usually what happens is the loaches and the cobras would fly around. Guys were pretty much crazy. I mean, those loaches would low level down there, you know, and just irritate people, just like poking a stick in, you know, in a tree until they got shot at. And of course, that was kind of a natural selection process, because if the Vietnamese didn't know at that point that when you shot at the loach there was a cobra going to roll in on you, then they weren't going to live very long, which is what happened to them, because then the cobras would roll in. And then if there was something that was left over, like a rucksack or whatever, you know, we'd go on the ground, recover it. If the helicopter got shot down, which could happen, we would go in and secure the area where the helicopter was until they could lift it out. If another helicopter was, you know, from some other unit was shot down, we would go secure that.
No matter where you were at the fire base or in the boonies, life in Vietnam was tense, and no one wanted to be the last man to die in a war your country had already decided was as good as over.
It was always tense, okay? Vietnam was always tense. You were always on guard. And it seemed like the worst times would be when there was no contact, when you might not see anybody or anything and you're just moving around. It would be like it was, those were kind of like the worst times, because everything's building up, you're waiting, you're anticipating that contact, or them finding you or you finding them. You know, it's always was on 100% alert. And that was a hard thing. It's a hard thing not to do. Is just you're waiting and you're waiting, and boom. And then when you do get in contact, hopefully it's just for a very short time. Maybe it's not. You know, and if you're lucky enough and see them far enough ahead of time, relay a message, and you don't have to have contact. You know, but it was just. It was different periods when I was there. It was like from 1 minute to the next, you know, you're on your guard. You're on your guard all the time. And then all of a sudden, bam, there it went. Within contact, something was going on. And then shuts off. We're either moving out, or they have, whatever. Yeah, it just always clicking on off. It was hard. It was hard, but it got to be like a rush.
In 1971, Richard Nixon wanted to make a major move against communist strongholds in Laos. The plan was codenamed Lam Son 719, in honor of the birthplace of Le Loi, a Vietnamese nationalist who repelled the Chinese invaders in 1428. The objective was to disrupt an ongoing North Vietnamese army supply buildup at Zapon, Laos. While the ground troops, including armored units, were to be all from the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, or ARVN, the United States provided air support through fighter bombers and helicopter gunships. The greatest enemy to success of the operation was the South Vietnamese Army itself. Thoroughly infiltrated with communist spies at all levels, many senior leaders and their critical planning staffs were not informed of the mission or its goals until a few weeks or even days before moving to jump-off locations in order to prevent the traitors and spies from passing on the secrets of the mission to their counterparts in the north. As a result, most units were hastily moved to the border and thrust out of the country into maneuver combat with little or no preparation. In addition, the stifling political rifts between many senior military and political leaders involved prevented crucial cooperation between those who could ensure success. As a result, commanders and formations were confused and depended heavily upon support from the Western Allies at a time when the war effort was to be increasingly assumed by the forces of South Vietnam. While the early phases of Lam Son 719 seemed to go well, the North Vietnamese Army waited deep in Laos in ambush, utterly defeating the troops of the South, destroying or capturing dozens of artillery pieces, tanks, and hundreds of helicopters with newly supplied Soviet wire-guided or heat-seeking missiles. The efforts of the Allies to build up the weapons, formations, and leadership of the South Vietnamese military were destroyed in a few weeks of confusion and betrayal inside Laos. Many of the best leaders and units of the South were decimated at a time when they were most needed to take over the war. American political considerations and the resulting calendar of withdrawal meant that the disaster would ultimately be a death blow to the efforts of the South to resist communist advances on their own. From this operation until the end of the war, the South Vietnamese government retreated all the way back to the presidential palace in Saigon in 1975.
I went into first I went in recon. First of the 501st, that's who I was with, recon.
The battle plan for Lam Son 719 involved an attack by the Airborne Division and the 1st Armored Brigade along Highway 9 to Alui and then on to Zepon, where Highway 9 intersected the Ho Chi Minh Trail. 22 miles inside Laos, Zepon was a major enemy communications and supply hub. The highway was to be kept open as the main supply route. The 1st Infantry Division was to attack on a parallel axis to the main attack along the high ground south of the Zepon River and protect the southern flank of the Airborne Division. The Ranger Group would establish fire bases north of the highway and protect the right flank. A Marine Brigade would remain in reserve near Khe Son. Lam Son 719 got underway on February 8, 1971.
It was supposedly all ARVN, the Vietnamese army was going to do it, but the 101st was with them. A few other divisions, I'm not quite sure exactly. Like I said, I didn't know much more than what we had to do at the time.
The operation began as planned, with the 1st Armored Brigade Task Force advancing 9 kilometers along Highway 9 on the first day, and with 3 battalions of the 1st Infantry Division air assaulting south of the highway, and 2 battalions of the Airborne Division assaulting to the north. By February 25th, the invading forces had discovered enemy supply bases 1 and 2 kilometers square and had cut a major POL pipeline. However, the tide was beginning to turn, and enemy infantry supported by tanks overran Firebase 31, capturing 120 South Vietnamese, including the battalion commander. With 3 enemy divisions pressuring them, the Rangers began to withdraw from their fire bases. Unable to continue the advance along Highway 9, General Lam decided to use his air mobile assets to launch an air assault on Zepon, and on March 6th, 120 Hueys lifted 2 ARVN infantry battalions into the town, capturing it against light enemy resistance. The enemy reacted aggressively, rushing reinforcements to the area, including tanks. The U.S. Army Cobras tried to halt the enemy armor and had some success sweeping the accompanying infantry from the tanks using 2.75-inch flechette rockets. But the usual high-explosive rockets had only limited success in stopping the tanks. Even when high-explosive anti-tank rockets were available, the results were mixed. In order to score a direct hit, the rocket had to be fired from a distance of 500 to 1,000 meters, which brought the Cobras into the range of the tank's machine guns and the enemy infantry in the area. A dedicated tank-busting helicopter was sorely needed. The U.S. helicopter crewmen went against the heaviest anti-aircraft barrage incurred in the war. Soon enemy pressure bogged down the ARVN advance. Poor weather and heavy air defense opposition began to limit the air support available to relieve the pressure. The offensive was halted before reaching its first objective. The stalled troops were pounded again and again by the NVA and Cong forces. Soon they began to withdraw. The ARVN retreat became a rout, and the rout became panic. U.S. commanders tried to save the day by calling in the cavalry, and A Troop got its orders.
They flew us out there, and we were setting up on the Quezon Plains out there, where the old base had been. I can't remember really seeing many maps or anything. I can remember getting sent out there. They dropped us off kind of by ourselves, just a gaggle of us, and got on the radio trying to figure out where I was supposed to go, contact somebody, and they said we're over here to the west or something like that. So, you know, we just started off in that direction.
But for Lieutenant Wagner, the day was cut short.
And the next thing I know, there's an explosion, and one of my guys was laying on the ground. And we're not quite sure exactly at that point really what had happened. So Doc, our medic, he starts to go to the guy, and all of a sudden there's an explosion, he's down. At that point, you know, we're in a minefield. So I told everybody to stay where they were. I had the morphine in my pocket because that's kind of what you did then. And so I took my bayonet out and I started to probe to work my way over to Doc and to DeMarco was the name of the first guy who was hurt. And I don't remember getting very far. And I don't know if I was on a pressure release or what, but the next thing I knew, I was on the ground too. And you know, I looked back, I could see my foot was all blown apart. And I felt a real sticky feeling between my legs because I'd gotten wounded there too. And at first you just don't know anything, you know, what's going on. You're just kind of stunned. And then eventually you start getting kind of shocky, you know, and start shivering and stuff. And then a medevac helicopter came, and these guys came down on a sling. And I can remember telling them, don't stand down, don't step down here, don't step down here. And this guy, I don't know if he could see from up there or what, or he was just the bravest guy I've ever seen. He, you know, put a sling around me, and up I went.
Once on board the medevac, Wagner had one concern.
I was on a helicopter, and I kept asking, well, frankly, if my balls been blown off, because that's what I was worried about, because I knew they made plastic feet. And I was only about 23, and I had just other things I intended to do with my life. And I don't remember, I remember getting back, and then there was a succession of back hospitals I went to. I was stabilized. I'm sure I was at Quang Tri for a little while. And I went someplace else. And then I ended up in Japan, where they kept people, I think, to stabilize them until I flew them back. The doctor would come to me, change dressing, say, we're going to, number 10 foot, we'll have to cut it off when you get back to the United States. And flew back on a C-141, I think, all loaded with litters.
With overall enemy pressure increasing and the weather worsening, the problem now was how to withdraw while still in contact with the enemy. It proved impossible to keep the highway open and secure. So many of the ARVN units were withdrawn by helicopter and often under fire. Panic occasionally set in, and some helicopter crews resorted to greasing the skids of their Hueys to prevent ARVN troops clinging to them during the evacuation process. The last elements of the 1st Infantry Division were extracted on March 21st, and the rest of the invasion force a few days later. Thousands of tons of ammunition, supplies, and POL had been destroyed by the ARVN units and U.S. TAC air and B-52 strikes. The invading force had been driven out by the North Vietnamese with heavy losses. The South Vietnamese government claimed that just under 14,000 enemy had been killed against 6,000 ARVN killed and wounded. American figures estimated ARVN losses at around 50%. United States aircrew losses were 176 killed, 1,942 wounded, and 42 missing. Helicopter losses were put at 107 destroyed and 600 damaged. Lam Son proved that the ARVN troops were no match for the Communists. Lam Son 719 was the last major engagement of the U.S. troops in Vietnam, but it was not the end of their war. For 2 more years, the men of the U.S. Armed Forces went out on patrols, defended fire bases, and died.
I worked with that was, I think, all the way into August 5th with recon, and I stepped on a landmine in an area that was there was supposedly a battalion of NVA soldiers in there. We were in getting information, and we had to hook up as a platoon to be pulling us out, and I stepped on a landmine that day. And that was basically pretty much the end of Vietnam for me.
Finally, on March 29, 1973, the last American ground combat forces left Vietnam.
We were part of an alliance in Southeast Asia and in the Vietnam War. Everyone thinks in terms of NATO, the North American Treaty Organization, which the United States was a part, facing the Soviet Union, the Warsaw Pact, for 40 years in Western Europe. What we forget was that there was an alliance in Southeast Asia as well. The SEATO, or Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, included a number of nations in the area, most of whom sent combat troops to serve alongside the United States in Vietnam. Some of the nations of SEATO also sent special operators into the theater. Both Australia and New Zealand had SAS, or Special Air Service troops, a form of commando that were also a strike force that were used throughout Vietnam. South Korea sent troops to fight in South Vietnam, which include their Marines and other special operators. The ARVN, or Army of the Republic of Vietnam, also developed its own parallel organizations to the United States military. They too had a Marine Corps, Rangers, and Special Forces, and even SEALs, which they also used in operations not only within their own nation, but against North Vietnam itself. So in the middle 1970s, when the United States was turning the war over to the local Vietnamese, called Vietnamization, they were training the South Vietnamese army to take over. They were enabling it with weapons and skills so that they could take on the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army themselves. As the United States military left, some of those very last to back out of Vietnam were the special operators, with the last being the United States Navy SEALs all the way to 1975. And so, first in, last out were the special operators in the war in the shadows. There's a great legacy of special operating from Vietnam. Many of the special operating techniques that were developed in Vietnam were ones that had to be continued on during the rest of the Cold War, as the insurgencies and guerrilla warfare continued throughout the globe. The United States Army and Marine Corps sniping programs for the first time continued on past the end of the conflict and are operational to this very day. Marine Force Recon is still in operation, for example. And from their re-inception in the 1st of February 1969, the United States Army Ranger companies joined battalions and then the 75th Ranger Regiment and are still active around the planet to this very day. Perhaps the great nexus of special operating in Vietnam that affects us the most to this day was the prisoner of war situation. In 1970, a decision was made to attack a major prisoner of war camp right on the outskirts of Hanoi in North Vietnam. When the decision was made, none of the services themselves had enough assets or the special training or troops available to do it. And so it became a large joint operation, the Sante raid of 1970. Utilizing very large U.S. Navy helicopters, which had the range and troop carrying capacity to take troops in, the United States Air Force joined with large refueling aircraft and close air support, which could support the mission all the way to Hanoi and back. And the dismounts aboard those Navy helicopters were teams of United States Special Forces troops. In 1970, when the Sante raid was launched, it was actually trained and rehearsed in the United States. The replica of the camp that was built using screens had to be taken down occasionally every 24 hours because of the overflight of Soviet satellite passing overward. In order to prevent the compromise of the mission, they would take the camp down and disperse the troops and stop training when they knew the satellite was passing over. But when they got the green light to go, they deployed to Vietnam and they went in. When the Sante raid arrived, one of the helicopters flew off course and actually landed in the wrong compound. As they did so, many Vietnamese soldiers ran out from their beds, grabbing weapons, and they began to spray bullets. As it turned out, quite by accident, the officer candidate school course in session at that time was completely wiped out by mistake by the Sante raiders. Then they moved on to the proper compound where they found that the prisoners had just recently been removed. It seemed for a long time that this tremendous mission, put together at great cost and planning and expense, had been a failure. But as it turned out, it forced the North Vietnamese to consolidate all their prisoners that were scattered throughout Southeast Asia into the Hanoi Hilton. They had to put them all together in one place where they could be counted, where the Red Cross and other organizations knew where they were. They had to be better treated, and the morale was much better. And so when the United States negotiated their withdrawal from Southeast Asia and Vietnam, we were able to get most of our prisoners back that were being held in North Vietnam, many of them for many, many years. The long-term effect of the Sante raid is this. The United States military began to think in terms of joint operations for its special operating. What that means is no longer would they have the failures, such as the SS Mayaguez hostage situation in 1975. You would not have to throw together an operation such as Desert One in 1979 to try to rescue the Tehran, Iran hostages from the students. You didn't have to throw things together like this anymore. Instead, the United States military began to think in terms of joint operations and training that way, not just when the problem arose, but in peacetime and constantly, to be able to do some very high-speed operations where every service was able to supply its strength to the force.
A lot of lessons learned from Vietnam have been preached and taught in the curriculum at Fort Bragg. So in reality, I think a lot has been passed on because a lot of our the guys that were in SOG ended up staying in, were sergeant majors and officers, and they have basically interwoven our experiences and lessons learned into the curriculum down at Fort Bragg. So I feel very good. And I think that the kids are much better prepared now, much smarter. Their equipment is far superior to what we had. I think probably my
looking back on recon, there's a movie, Starman. I don't know if you've seen it. It's about an alien, and he ultimately escapes to somewhere out west, and the mothership is going to pick him up. And this reporter who's been trying to help him escape from the feds and others who apparently wanted to dissect him, the reporter asked this alien Starman, "What did you learn about humans?" And Starman thinks and scratches his chin and says, "You are at your best when times are worst." And I think that's what I look back on recon and the guys in it. Most of them, all of them except 2 were draftees. So they didn't ask to be in recon. They were assigned there, and we were quick learners. We had to be. We weren't Ranger qualified. We weren't Pathfinders. About half of us were from the South and used to hunting and trapping and that kind of environment. But we pulled together, and I think throwing people into an atmosphere like that and watching them come together and being able to work like a hand instead of individual fingers against some pretty rough situations.
I'll leave you on this one story, but the hardest thing, the singularly most difficult thing that I ever had to do in my entire military career was to write a letter. That to me, there was no preparation, no school. Oh, there was a regulation. We had to get the letter out, and it had to start to go through channels right away, and we only had 48 hours to do it. But I'm telling you, and the worst part about writing a letter was when you really had intimate knowledge of this young soldier. Some of these kids that I trained with at Fort Campbell, you got to know them, you got to know them, you got to know their families through them. You didn't want to, but you did. I mean, you were pretty close, you were pretty tight. And that to me was the most difficult thing. Even today, when I think back on it, I just never wanted to do that again. It was the hardest thing I ever had to do.